We've said it many times throughout this course. The purpose of the church today is quite simply to go and make disciples. And that's why it's important to talk about numbers as well. I know that sometimes this kind of talk can seem a bit strange, maybe a little too pragmatic for our tastes, and it almost makes us feel awkward, as if talking about numbers in multiplication makes the whole discussion much less spiritual, too human. I know very well that in today's context, people often make the mistake of giving too much importance to numbers because we make it solely about performance, a response to our need for control. But that's not the purpose for which the Bible talks about them. In fact, we see that in the Bible, numbers have an incredible value. Just think that from the very first sermons of the apostles, when we read in Acts, Peter's first sermon, they literally counted how many people were added to the first church. Why is this important? Because it helps us understand that for God, numbers are not insignificant, and not because we need to keep an attendance sheet to show how much our church is growing, but because it shows us how healthy our church is and how much it is fulfilling Jesus' command to go and multiply. And in fact, this is also very important because when we see that our church is growing only by addition or by natural growth, which could be through family units and so on, and it is not multiplying as the Bible commands us, this should raise some questions for us and make us ask, okay, how can we realign ourselves with the vision that Jesus had for the church? And I think this topic is really important. But why are numbers also just as dangerous? Just think about the Bible, okay? We see at a certain point at the end of the second book of Samuel, chapter 24, David wants to take a census. And this is very important because this census will have drastic consequences for the people. But this story teaches us an important principle. At that point in history, David was trying to understand what the operational strength would be for a possible battle. Who among the people were able to fight? In other words, many theologians identify this as his motivation. And so David wanted to find within these numbers, within this census, answers that were actually shifting his focus from God's providence to human results. In fact, we read that there were only 3 principles within Deuteronomy that prevented a king from being identified as such. In Deuteronomy it is written, if you should ever appoint a king, know this, he must abide by these 3 rules. He must not have too many horses, he must not have too many wives, and he must not have too much gold. And these are 3 principles that have to do with numbers, because the moment you start placing all your trust in your military strength, in your wealth, and in your fleeting pleasures, you are shifting your focus away from God's idea of numbers and multiplication. And that's why it is extremely important. Sometimes we think that talking about numbers, or rather counting, automatically makes our service in church less spiritual, but that's not the case. On the contrary, it simply makes it less ideal and more real. In fact, I believe that our purpose, when we bring it to life, is to define specific numbers in order to establish growth and see if we are following and respecting the goals we are setting together with the Holy Spirit. So we shouldn't let ourselves become obsessed with numbers, but we should still use them as a tool to assess the health and analyze how our group is growing and multiplying. So on a practical level, what does this discussion about numbers mean within a life group? We know that the purpose of a life group is for it to be a small group so that it can be intimate, so that deep relationships can be built and meaningful exchanges can take place. So when the life group becomes too large, it will be difficult to build these relationships in a healthy way, and at the same time, if the life group is too small, it could become a bit discouraging for people because they might always end up dealing with the same 2 or 3 people, and if someone happens to be absent that time, it could just be one person and the life group leader. So to avoid these situations, it's also very important that we define a multiplication strategy based on real numbers. In general, we recommend that a life group should multiply as soon as it reaches between 15 and 20 people. And this preparation time for multiplication it starts much earlier, at least 4 to 6 months before, during which the group begins to prepare in terms of numbers. We see that stability is being built among the people, because it's logical that if there was only one occasion, just one evening of the life group, when there were 20 people present, but for the rest of the year there are only 8 of us, then it becomes difficult to rely on those numbers as accurate. So when we see regularity being established, a faithfulness from the people, and we notice that we're starting to reach certain numbers, it's important to move towards multiplication. In several parts of this course, you will have seen that there are good, excellent, and even incredible strategies for identifying life leaders. In fact, we won't be talking about that here, but it's important to be very practical even when it comes to space. If the place where you hold your life group is already cramped with 10 people, it might make sense to anticipate multiplication and not be too rigid about these numbers. So instead of waiting until you reach 15, maybe you stop at 12, because you see that group with 6 or 8 people, that environment, that room with 6 or 8 people is perfect. You are also practical according to the needs of your group, and you also understand that multiplication must follow a logic that relates to the territory, to discipleship, and also on a practical level to things like age. In fact, when you see that the ages are starting to diverge towards two opposite ends, it can be a great time to multiply and split the group into two age ranges. It is therefore important that we, as leaders, pay extremely close attention to how our life group is going, even in these more practical aspects. Just think about this. Jesus tells the story of the Good Shepherd. He had 100 sheep, he loses one, and he sees the other 99. This implies something very important. He was able to recognize, because he counted them, that one was missing, and he went to look for that one lost sheep. If we are not able to recognize these numbers, if we are not able to know the numbers of our group, we will never be able to identify and find that lost sheep. In fact, this is also important for the health of the life group. Wow, it's been about a month that I haven't seen this person anymore. It's been a month that from being 20, we've become 10. Why is that? Where did these 10 people go? Where did these sheep go? In fact, this is exactly the standard that Jesus set for a good leader, for a good shepherd. So we need to align ourselves with this. For Jesus' ministry, numbers were important, and not because he could boast about them to anyone. In fact, he didn't have other churches to show off differences in numbers or member attendance. So we understand that this isn't a matter of competition, but rather a constructive matter. In fact, we see that on 2 occasions he found himself feeding, by multiplying food, 5,000 and 4,000 people. Even in that environment, in that context, Jesus was counting the people. And not only did he count the people, he also counted the resources, the loaves and the fish. And he also counted how much was left over after the multiplication for each of them, because it was divided, it was multiplied. And in the end, there were baskets and precise amounts left over. So this helps us understand that even for Jesus, numbers did not make something less holy or less sacred. On the contrary, they gave even more value to the miracle. In fact, perhaps miracles cannot be measured in quantitative terms, but they will certainly have an impact that cannot leave the people we interact with indifferent. Many times a distinction is made between quality and quantity, but before I finish, let me tell you this story that always amazes me. A professor assigned a specific task to 2 groups of students. One group had to make as many pots as possible, without stopping, as many as they could. To the other group, he gave this mission instead: make only 1 pot, but make it perfect. And this story teaches the difference between quantity and quality, because we imagine that the group who made only 1 pot would have made the best pot. But instead, this experiment produced a completely different result. The group that made the best pots were actually the ones who focused on making the greatest number of pots, because all that practice, the higher volume, allowed them to refine their results so much that they ended up making pots that were incredibly superior to the single one made by the group that had only 1 task. So we shouldn't make too much of a distinction. Sometimes we focus on this difference between quality and quantity, but we see that very often, both in natural life and in spiritual life, these 2 phenomena coincide.